Hello, my name is Amanda Kirby Okoye. I'm a lawyer, image historian, and the creative director at Joliba Heritage and Culture. I have been interested in Nigerian history since I was taken to Nigeria at 14 on holiday. Nigeria to me was a foreign land, but from the minute I landed at the airport, I felt at home. And interestingly, I felt the issue of identity, something I had battled with most of my life, was about to be addressed. One of the most significant observations too was the role of Igbo women in society. On the face of it, a generation of Igbo women appeared quite submissive, but the reality of their roles had interestingly quite a contradictory outcome. Many of these submissive women were the bankers of the family. Some would take on important roles in the community, and sometimes decisions such as bringing a new wife to the home would be made by them. I was fortunate enough to have a connection to my strong maternal side. And though I was not brought up in the environment they had been brought up in, I had witnessed the strength and leadership qualities they had possessed. It was interesting when I observed some senior female members of my family. They seemed to juxtapose two attitudes. An individual could appear submissive, yet the embodiment of feminist qualities. Some of the women in my family had played leadership roles in early independent Nigeria, and that pricked my interest to want to know more about Igbo women. So, the issue of women and leadership is an interest to me, especially in a male-dominated Igbo and, of course, Nigerian society. The concept of female participation in decision-making, directly or indirectly, is not new and had been the norm very early in our history. As we know, pre-colonial Igbo society was composed of kingdoms and mini-states. The various societies in Igbo land had different variations of political structures. This would differ depending on the area. Most Igbo communities' power and its politics were vested in its leaders and titled chiefs. In others, it was a council of elders working with titled chiefs and senior age grades. The very nature of this structure and the fluidity of the societies contributed to the wide dispersal of political authority among the sexes, age grades, and societies. Despite the more subdued role that women would appear to take in traditional Igbo society, historically women had played outstanding economic and political roles. It would appear that right from time, Igbo men had recognized women as important partners in the administration of the Igbo society, hence the dual gender system. Women basically held complementary positions to men. Women had clear economic opportunities within the social system. In fact, it would appear that before the middle of the 20th century, Nigerian women contributed significantly to their society, arguably more than their European counterparts. No doubt, on the face of it, men dominated, but the structure of pre-colonized Igbo societies were intelligent and fluid enough to accord certain complex political opportunities to their womenfolk. So, women could be given certain powers based on kinship. Some of these women included royalty and heads of women's organizations. In some Igbo societies, the Isi Ada played political, religious, and judicial roles. She was not only the venerator of all female deities in her lineage, but also performed cleansing and proprietary functions. She was regarded as the mother of the lineage meetings. In some communities, the Isi Ada would even participate in the decision-making process. Royal women also played an important role. In some societies, the woman's power was equivalent to that of an Ndieche. An example of this would be in Abo, where the wife who held a title of Idibo wielded political power and authority equivalent to that of an Ndieche. There were also female rulers, Ezenwine Nnachi, who presided over the state government as the fourth ruler of Arachuku. And in the late 19th century in Eseleoku, a female regent ruled on behalf of a young, underaged king. In some communities, women's organizations acted parallel to the authority structures of men. It could be seen as a complementary system. So for example, Women could direct authority through all female organisations, example, the market women's authorities, secret societies and aid grade institutions. Women wielded collective and individual powers as heads and members of these organisations respectively. One such example of a group of women who yielded such powers outside the royal household or any other man was the Omu. In Onitsha, the Omu exercised enormous political power and influence over women and men. They were the only women who held the Ofo. They would form the Otu Ogene, whose members held titles close to that of the Obis Ndieche. The British colonial administration did not recognise this system, and with the arrival of the colonisers, it altered the position of various Nigerian women in their societies. They replaced all the customs of institutions run by men, restricting women and focusing colonial economics on men. This could only be compared to the way they subjugated their own women back in the United Kingdom, pre-suffragette movements and other forms of oppressive devices. The intrusion of colonial rule brought to Africa the European notion of that time, that women belonged in the home. But confusingly, at the same time, Igbo societies still expected women to work in the farm or in the market. The irony of this was, at the time this was happening, the colonial empire was headed by a woman, Queen Victoria. But what her new subjects were seeing was a male colonial presence sent to administer and take over, showing the new subjects that authority equaled masculinity. Despite the more subdued role women were to take, Igbo women still insisted on being heard, and as Gloria Chukwu highlighted in her book, the first known evidence of an Igbo woman serving in the colonial government was that of Madam Okoye, who was made a member of the Onitsha Native Court in 1912. Madam Okoye was a successful businesswoman who had learned her trade in Igala country and had established commercial relationships with African and European agents. Madam Okoye grew to become one of the most outstanding Igbo traders and an agent of the Niger Company. From 1931 to the 1940s, she was the chief of the Waterside Settlement, a position that gave her a seat on the Onitsha Native Court. She was also called Eze Otu, meaning chief of the Otu Water Settlement. She was an advisor to Obi Okosi I of Onitsha, and crowned the Omu of Osomari in 1935. Despite the limited representation and lack of encouragement to empower Igbo women, Igbo land also had women like Ahebe Ubabe from Umu Ida, Enugu Ezike, who after a twist of fate would become warrant chief and then later Eze. This Igbo woman would be made the only female warrant chief in all of colonial Nigeria. Though she commanded respect from her people, as well as that of the colonial authorities, the people would eventually become uneasy with her gender play and had shown resistance to her implementation of the British tax. There was a resistance to her being the face of those taxing her own people. Despite a woman implementing the colonial taxation, it would be Igbo women and women of today's South-South that would vehemently oppose this, as seen in the Abo Women's Rights of 1927 and Aba Women's War of 1929. Abebe's fall from grace may have been a reflection of colonial Nigeria's mindset against women. When it came down to it, the British colonial administrators who once supported her now wanted to see this powerful figure put in her place. Taxation was one of the greatest motivations for women to stand up collectively against the colonial administration. In 1927, the women of Ndokwa clan, Abo, in present-day Delta State rioted. The women mobilized and took to the streets to protest the unwarranted and exploitative direct tax system by the British government, popularly called the anti-tax riots. Many women lost their lives as a result of the British brutality. In 1929, the Aba Women's War, where thousands of women organised a massive revolt against the policies imposed by British colonial administrators in southeastern Nigeria, would prove to be the most serious challenge to the British rule in the history of the colony. It took months for the government to suppress it. Women all over Igbo land and today's South-South of Nigeria congregated in protest at both the warrant chiefs and the taxes on the market women. using the traditional practice of censoring men through all-night song and dance, ridicule, often called sitting on a man. The women chanted and danced, and in some locations forced warrant chiefs to resign their positions. The colonial police and troops were called in. They fired into the crowds and killed more than 50 women and wounded many others. The women proved worthy adversaries and would not back down until the colonial authorities dropped their plans to impose a tax on the market women. One of the consequences of these clashes, especially that of 1929, was that more Igbo women would serve in the colonial native administration. For example, there were female representatives in Mbesi Native Court, another in Okwala Native Court, and 3 in Omu Okpa Native Court. Women began to play roles once again in the selection of new chiefs, but in no way can we confuse these moves as deliberate efforts by the colonial government as a sign to improve and promote female participation in the Igbo region. The colonial government actually undermined Igbo women's political power, and one can argue that some of these positions were token or extremely personally motivated. Towards the end of colonialism, women's groups and associations began sprouting up around the country. The power and effect of this network had been seen during the 1929 riots and its ripple effect across the country. The leaders of the Aba Women's War and the massacre of many women had come to the attention of people like Ali Motu Pelewura, a powerful Yoruba female trader. She would lead market women in protest against direct taxation of women by the colonial government in the southwest. Also, powerful women's associations like the National Council of Women's Association would be set up in various cities in the southern part of Nigeria. These included the Enugu Women's Society, set up in 1945 by several women, including Mrs. Janet Okala, and the Aba Women's Society, set up in the 1950s by Mrs. Margaret Ekpo. The female wings of political parties were also formed, and it provided women with a much desired platform to engage in the political process. Enfranchisement, supported by 2 of the most important political leaders of the time, Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo, offered women the chance to participate in the election process as voters and contestants for elective offices. Southern women were now about to gain a national voice and given the right to vote. Women like Mrs. Mary Nzimiru joined the largest party in Nigeria, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, which was formed in 1944 under the leadership of Herbert Macaulay and Nnamdi Azikiwe. The party permitted women to be part of 2 of the most important decision-making organs of the party, the National Executive Committee and the Central Working Committee. The Regional Working Committee members of the party also included Mrs. Janet Mokelu, Mrs. Flora Azikiwe, Mrs. Wogu, Mrs. Nzirimo, and Mrs. Adama Okpara in the 1950s and 1960s. Other women served as council members under NCNC. These included Mrs. Comfort Okoye, Mrs. Wogu, Mrs. Egbuche, Mrs. Okala, and Mrs. Janet Mokelu in Enugu, and Bessie Oboma. Women were indeed a powerful force. They campaigned hard for their party and their seats on regional and national levels. When Michael Okpara was elected as Premier of the Eastern Region and Akanu Ibiam its governor in December 1959, amongst its 30 executive committee members were Mrs. Margaret Ekpo, Mrs. Felicia Obuwa, Mrs. Mary Nzimiro, and Mrs. J.D. Ededem. Mary Nzimiro is an example of the persuasive nature and hard work put in by women for the greater good of the party. She was instrumental in her husband's election as the first mayor of Port Harcourt municipality. She was even called the mother of NCNC. Igbo women were instrumental to NCNC's success in the Eastern region, obtaining seats in the National Assembly, and their mobilization and voice were lent to helping Nnamdi Azikiwe become the first president of Nigeria. After independence, in October 1st, 1960, Mrs. Janet Mokelu and Mrs. Margaret Ekpo would be elected into the Eastern House of Assembly in the 1961 regional elections. Both women contributed immensely to the parliamentary debates in the Eastern House of Assembly. Between independence in 1960 till date, Nigeria has had to endure interrupted civil rule, coups, and almost 3 decades of military dictatorship. Very few of these governments included women. General Ironsi's 6 months regime included no women. Because of the fallout of the January 1966 coup, which was given an ethnic slant, Igbos practically had limited or no participation in government. During the Civil War years, from 1967 to 1970, Igbo women were very visible in the southeast of Nigeria. Colonel Ojukwu, the head of the Biafran government, insisted on the involvement of women in the wartime politics and activities in Biafra. He appointed Mrs. Janet Mokelu and Mrs. Kazai Asinobi, amongst others, to the Biafran Consultative Assembly. Women also served as officers in intelligence, the medical corps, and were also part of the women's diplomatic delegation. From 1966 to 1999, Nigeria experienced a very long period of military rule, as stated earlier. The military's interruption to democracy was marked by the dominance of an all-male military rule, in which women were hardly represented. However, a number of internal and external developments have combined to inspire events which increase women's political participation. Successive military governments were signatories to certain international declarations on the issues of women's rights. For example, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. With this, the trend in women's political participation vastly improved, and the increase of female appointments as ministers, permanent secretaries, advisors, and special assistants to the president and vice president were more apparent. In line with this, there has been an increase in Igbo women's political participation in both appointive and elective positions into the National Assembly, the State Assembly, and the local government councils. There is no doubt that the trend in the participation of Igbo women in politics has improved since the 1960s, owing to the impact of internal and externally induced changes. Some of these changes, especially in education, have been more revolutionary. The thing is, despite the so-called representation in the native courts after the riots of 1929 and the political seats Igbo women fought for and won in the lead-up to the independence, the role of women and their natural progression has been hampered by colonial intrusion and the all-male symbol of power and administration. Many of the mindsets they introduced still exist today. But despite society's patriarchal tendencies, Igbo women have continued to prove to be disruptors, thanks to great women like Mrs. Margaret Epo, Mrs. Janet Mokelu, Mrs. Victoria Onejeme, Engineer Ebele Okeke, Professor Joy Ogu, Dame Virgie Etiaba, and many, many others.